It's lively and it's unrehearsed. We welcome you in again to another edition of our program, Moral Side of the News. We're glad you're with us this weekend. I'm John Blim with the WHAS Crusade for Children. With me, as always, is a distinguished panel this week. Reverend Sally McClain, retired Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Rabbi Stan Miles, faculty, Louisville Melton School. Reverend Daniel Corrie Shull, Burnett Avenue Baptist Church. And Father Joe Graffis, Archdiocese of Louisville. For our first topic today, Louisville is home to one of the 10 largest Cuban populations in the country, and horror over Cuba's economic crisis spilled onto the streets here at home this week. Cuban immigrants held a rally to support anti-government protesters in Cuba, where high prices and shortages of food and medicine are all at a critical point. President Biden says the Cuban people are demanding their freedom from an authoritarian regime. I don't think we've seen anything like this protest in a long, long time, if ever, frankly. So turning to our panel, a moral side of the news. And do you think we'll see a change in Cuba? The government has limited internet access and is arresting protesters. Let's get your thoughts.
I think it's what's happening in Cuba now reminds me what was happening in the former Soviet Union when it broke up around 30 years ago or so, and people crave freedom. The one thing that I don't understand, that I can't understand at all, is the guy who ran the truck into the governmental center downtown. It just, this is Louisville. It's not Havana. We sympathize with people who are trying to get freedom, and number one, it makes no sense to me. Number two, it worries me. It worries me because there are people who really don't feel that way about freedom in the world, who will point their finger and say, oh no, another immigrant who is new to our country did something hurtful. And so I worry that by an act like that, the message would be all too muddied.
I think it doesn't surprise me that it's happening in Cuba because of a lot of things. Obviously, the Castros are pretty well gone now, and the corruption and the problems are even more evident. After COVID, it's got to be even more evident. What should be our policy in the midst of all of this is a little confusing, but we've got another problem. Obviously, Haiti is another one of the situations, like so many of these Central American countries that have had dictatorships, and there's a real need for freedom for all these people. But how do you go about doing that without it being violent is a real conundrum. And but I'm glad to see that it's happening in Cuba. I'm fear for the response that they might get, but I also think we need to be more aware of it in our country, where anything outside our borders we are sometimes pretty ignorant about.
I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I remember having to hide under your desk in case there was an issue, or the bomb shelters that we thought were going to go off, because the proximity of Cuba to the United States is so close and so dangerous. And how do we be an active presence, but not an active presence? Because we don't want, I don't think it's the United States' responsibility always to go in and make sure that freedom happens. I think it's up to the people to make their choice, that they have come to that point that because of desperation, they need some positive answers. So I'm wondering where the United Nations is on this, where NATO is on this, and how is this going to happen unless they actually rebel? And if they rebel, Joe, how is it possible that they're going to avoid violence?
Yeah, I think this is an unfortunate situation, but I think it's a turning point for every society throughout the world as we move toward the aftermath of COVID-19. It looks like Cuban residents are doing something that United States residents are refusing to do. Post-COVID, people in the US seem to be rushing back to the way things were instead of envisioning a better world, a more equitable society, a world that would serve everyone's needs, a world that takes into account our humanity and ways in which that humanity might be best honored. Unfortunately, we in the US seem to be rushing back to practices that prove to be detrimental to our personal flourishing pre-pandemic. We're doing that post-pandemic. But in Cuba, it seems like individuals there have said enough is enough, that it's time to make a radical shift. The revolution is dawning, and I celebrate that's happening, that they have decided, possibly because, at the behest of the pandemic, that they're not going to continue to live that way, that they're going to live in a different way. And I think if this causes revolution to take to the streets, revolution to happen in the streets, I think so be it. But a change needs to come to Cuba.
I worry about what the position will be with our government when Castro came to power in 1959. He was a great big question mark. And whatever happened, he ended up running into the arms of the Soviet Union and became Cuba became simply another client state of the Soviet Union. I think that we need to our government needs to very carefully assess what's going on in Cuba and see if we can help them. And we can help them in such a way that they will once again become one of the governments in both North America and Central and South America that have come together for everyone's self-interest. I remember an organization that existed before, it may still exist, for all I know, the Organization of American States. I think now more than ever, we need such an organization for everyone to work together for all people's mutual help, not governments necessarily, all people's mutual help.
All right, we're off to a good start on our program, Moral Side of the News. We're glad you're with us this weekend. Our second topic, also in the news this week, Kentucky Secretary of State Michael Adams testified before a U.S. House committee and basically said, hands off. Adams, a Republican, said, quote, Kentucky knows best what's best for Kentucky. He said there should be no micromanagement of state legislatures and election officials. So now, panel on Moral Side of the News, your thoughts on Secretary of State Adams saying Congress should not overstep its authority and force election procedures on the various states.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that we hear conservative politicians, conservative-minded people argue for states' rights until the states exercise their rights, and then we want the federal government to come in and unilaterally take over states' ability to facilitate their own elections. Well, I have a word for it. I don't think I can say the word on television, but it's foolishness. It is Donald Trump lost the election. We need to get over it. We're wasting money with these hearings that allege voting fraud, and it just didn't happen. It just didn't happen. And let's just be honest, in many communities throughout this nation, we struggle to get people to vote. We struggle to get people past the barriers to cast their ballot. People are not, voting fraudulently. It's just not one of the things that people are conspiring to do. And yet Republicans continue to walk down this silly path of another made-up controversy. And so I admire the Secretary of State for his strong stance there as he spoke to that council in DC, and I think we ought to also mention how wonderful of a job he did in overseeing our state's elections, and that ought not be overshadowed by the petty politics in our nation's capital.
Corrie, I agree with you, and thank you for that last statement, because as a Republican Secretary of State, he did do a very good job in our state and worked in a bipartisan way to make sure our elections were good. I think he has a point, but as we all know, there are some state legislatures who are they are reducing the opportunities to vote and limiting it to their own partisan advantage. So there's a balance here. I think the states certainly have a right to run their own elections. Should there be some guidelines federally that say, okay, these are standards that are federal standards, especially for federal elections? So it's not an either or, it's both and. And
I think there've always been federal standards.
Right.
And what's interesting to me is we have 48 states that have filed voter suppression legislation that has been aimed to keep Black people and Latinx people out of the voting booth. And yet the federal government seems to be doing nothing in order to beat back that anti-American treasonous legislation that is being put forth entirely by Republicans. Democrats are not trying to keep people from voting. Democrats, their ideas can win elections. Republicans, their ideas cannot win elections. Therefore, they need to curtail people's rights to vote. So in Georgia, you have laws being passed against people passing out water in voting lines. How ridiculous. But when your ideas will not garner support from the populace, then you have to strategize how you can keep people from voting altogether.
I was curious about the statement about the NAACP, and that I think it was something like African Americans want to vote in person. That's part of their culture. Corrie, do you agree with that? Is he on target with that?
Yeah, I think Black people want to vote, but here in a state like Kentucky, for the first time ever in the 2020 election, we were able to do early voting. I mean, this is not a new concept, but for some reason in Kentucky, a red state, it has not been put forward here. Black people want to vote, but Black people don't want to have to take off in order to vote. Black people want to be able to vote and vote in person, but they don't want it to interfere with their obligations for their jobs or caring for their families, et cetera. And so I think he is on target with that, but we need to create more pathways for people to vote. We need to not only have early voting, we need to have it where people can vote on Sundays. We need to have it where people can vote on Saturdays. The polls don't need to be open just from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. They need to be open later than that. There are so many ways that we can facilitate open elections and allowing more people to vote. And I think Secretary Adams has pushed us toward that, but I feel as though there are forces that want things to go back to the way that they were prior to the 2020 election, and we don't need to let that happen.
I thought part of what he was saying was that 3 days prior that people can vote, can cast a vote. Is that not correct? Is that when I read that article? So would that not help the situation some?
I think it would. But I think that there are operatives who are wanting to roll that back. So you remember in previous years, you could only vote on voting day.
Right, that's correct.
Because of the pandemic, Secretary Adams and his team, they widened that. So you had early voting, you were able to vote 3 days before they had various ways that facilitated the election. It was very orderly. There was no voting fraud in Kentucky, and people got a chance to get to the polls. There were no excuses for not being able to vote, and we need to keep that here in Kentucky, and not what some individuals want to happen, which is to go back to the old model where you can only vote on voting Tuesday between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. And if you don't get there between those hours, you can't cast your vote.
I think the other thing too, if I'm correct, Corrie, is that, we had no excuse absentee balloting, which certainly helps senior citizens and a lot of people who can't always get to the polls for many different reasons. And I think we've kind of backed off of that now, that you have to have an excuse to get an absentee ballot. Although Kentucky did a pretty good job, it seems, the state legislature, and not dealing with some of the issues that other states that you've already mentioned have done. But I fear that there are those who can back it up even more. I just think everybody should be given an opportunity to vote in a free country like ours. And there's no reason why we can't give more opportunities, weekends, Sundays, extending times, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, as many other states do. Obviously, it costs some money, but I think most people would say that's money well spent.
I think the interesting thing is we live in the U.S., which purports to be a free country, but voting has always been a bitterly contested issue. Voting originally was for white male landowners, and then it was expanded to white males, and then it was expanded to white people. And then in 1964, in the 1920s, women were given the right to vote. And then in 1964, Black people were given the right to vote. And we've been fighting the Voting Rights Act every decade since the 1960s. It makes no sense. We need to get over this. We need to understand that voting is for everybody. And I'm a proponent of there not being really any restrictions. If you are a tax-paying citizen, I think that you ought to be able to vote. If you are a citizen of the U.S., you ought to be able to vote. Why are we so invested in policies that restrict people's access to the polls? What is that about Americans that we want to limit people's access to vote?
And if one political party is behind these restrictions, I think it's the responsibility for people in that party to reassess their positions to see what's wrong, where they can become attractive to a voter base that is obviously wider than what their voter base is today. Right. But to call this political conservatism, I think is an insult to the notion of political conservatism. It's things are conservative unless they don't agree with what we want to accomplish, and then we will go in a totally different direction and still call it conservatism, and that just doesn't. It doesn't bode well. I don't think it bodes well for the party. I look at the people who represent the Republican Party, who represented the Republican Party in the past, and it's really rather disturbing to me. And I know it's disturbing to a lot of folks who are registered Republicans. This is not who they are. These are not the causes they espouse.
But when you talk about conservatism, what is conservatism? It is the effort to conserve something. And many times it plays out as the conserving of antiquated moral values. It plays out in antiquated notions of different ethnic groups, and so we have this sort of racism bubbling to the surface now that it embarrasses me. And I'm not even a Republican, and neither am I white, but I'm embarrassed by fellow countrymen saying some of the things and putting forth some of the things that they're putting forward. It's crazy to me. But they are under that conservative banner, and they're trying to conserve a certain way of life. I think Republicans really need to think about maybe changing themselves from always trying to conserve what they feel is slipping away from them. Maybe they should start embracing the future, and maybe that would cause more people to be open to their platform.
Corrie, I've never thought of it like that before, but I think you have a really valid point.
One of the things that I heard years ago, Corrie, a professor of mine, of course, it wasn't about politics. It was basically looking at sometimes church involvement, whether it's progressive or conservative. And he said the proper understanding of the word conservative, he phrased as preservative of the best in the tradition. Whether it's in church, whether it's scripture, whether it's a constitution, preserving the core best, our best values. That's what a good conservative preservative is all about. That really made a lot of sense to me when he gave that, trying to look at the context of our country and saying, how do we preserve our best values, not necessarily our worst angels.
I think that would be wonderful if it were true. The only issue is that as it relates to American society, we have been pursuing a more perfect union, which stands to reason that there were some of the things in the Constitution that did not need to be preserved. There were, like the whole 3/5 of a person type thing, and the whole exclusion of women things, and the whole exclusion of people who were of darker hue from other nations. I don't know, and that is just as American as freedom and the pursuit of happiness, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I'm concerned. I wonder though, what are we actually preserving, and what would we consider as the best elements of the American idea that is worth preserving, and have we ever reached those ideals in a state that's worth preserving them at that state?
I see the United States as a living organism. And in that, it's always expanding and contracting, expanding and contracting. And how can we do that in a way that enables us to be true to our core identity, and then allows us the freedom to encompass that which we never even thought of before? Because so much of this was never on our radar screen. And so we're trying to embrace, or not embrace is such a word as disembrace, what's going on. And so how can we continue to be that living organism, which is a true experiment in the way people govern themselves?
I think that's very important, because when you talk about so many things were not on our radar, that is so very true, which is why I think it is important to not get stuck in any particular era, but to be brave enough to become more radically inclusive as a nation. And I fear that too many of my Republican friends really don't want to do that, because they see it as a threat to who they are and to their understandings of America as a nation.
But that which cannot expand has the potential to implode.
And we see that happening.
I think, again, it relies with church or synagogue that, we all know as Christians that we weren't opposed to slavery for centuries upon centuries upon centuries. And then all of a sudden, what? Oh gosh, this, how can we do that and say we're religious people? So sometimes we just got to take the blinders off, but we have a lot of blinders on us.
I look at the United States of America as a work in progress since July 4th, 1776. Key phrase, in progress.
Right.
I felt that in most ways, not always, but in most ways, since July 4th, 1776, we have been going in the right direction. I look within the course of my lifetime, the Civil Rights Acts in, I believe, 1948 and 1964 and 1965. I look at the Immigrant Act of 1965, which literally opened the doors to this country as envisioned by Emma Lazarus, the words on the Statue of Liberty. In progress, I honestly feel that for the past few years, we haven't been in progress. We've gone back. We have regressed. And I hope this regression is temporary. I pray that this regression is temporary. If it isn't, then I honestly fear for life in this country.
What do you see as a temporary regression?
What we've spoken about today, Corrie, the idea of making it difficult for people to vote because they are members of a certain group or a certain race, of limiting our republic to, we're all for what you do, as long as you agree with us. If you don't agree with us, then we're going to make it as difficult for you to exercise your rights as we possibly can. We're going to put you down.
Nobody in power wants to give up power easily. And those in power don't want to expand. They just want to hold on to what they have. And that's not the way it's going to be anymore. It may be temporary, Stan, but I don't see that as a progression that's going to keep on going. I think too much has happened in the culture. I think we're going to change, and change is painful. And I think I've got a more positive outlook in saying that we are going to progress. We are going to encompass. We are going to be more of who we are instead of less.
All right, panel. Thanks to our panel on this edition of Moral Side of the News. Thank you to Sally McClain, Stan Miles, Daniel Corrie Shull, and Father Joe Graffis. Have a great week.